Cool. So welcome to LA Hug. Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Ben, Justin, who isn't here, but and Side Effects for having me present. Today we're going to be talking about FFX Collection. FFX being short for Fendra Effects, which is the kind of encompassing whole of my life's work, essentially. And this particular project or tool is pretty massive. Before we get into that, I'll just do a quick little bio about myself for those who don't know me. Let me put this over. There we go. My name is David Torno, and I am a former visual effects artist of 20 plus years, and I've held a number of different roles during that time. I was a technical director, was a compositor, a match mover, a pipeline script developer, and I also dabbled in photogrammetry. I've worked on tons and tons of projects during that time. The yellow highlighted ones there are kind of like the more popular ones that you would see, probably that you recognize for the most part. Lincoln Park being a big part of my career, and that was probably about 6 to 7 years of my career working with them at a company that had a contract with them. The DCEU logo as well, which you'll see still today in front of all of the DC movies, the animated characters that come across the DC comic stuff. Talking about Lincoln Park, this is some of the bits that I worked on there. I was primarily doing a lot of technical stuff. Like I was saying, compositing and match moving and all of that stuff. Waiting for the end, which is those top kind of clips up there. I did all of the motion tracking through all of the individual band members, as well as this character that we had on the far end over here, just to kind of make it more fantasy based. That centerpiece is a actual live video from the concert itself of one of the pieces I put together. It was a plug-in in After Effects of all things that was special made way back in the day when you could actually make plugins a lot easier. And then this bottom right one here being motion tracking that I did for the entire shot. It was a one take way around, but we cut it up and edit, but I had to track the whole thing in one piece. This was also before I got into volumetrics and particles, which is kind of what I specialized over the years. Relating to that DCEU animated logo, I did all of the volumetrics in that intro piece. This was comprised of two 4Ks, a 15 and 30 spot, I believe, and then a 20K version that's down below there that was used in Comic-Con in Hall H. So we had to replicate all of the builds, every bit of the animation, as well as the volumetric simulations. This was all back in the day when I was doing Turbulence FP in Cinema 4D, so this is Turbulence FP stuff. That far right up there is an R&D render piece that I had to do for the bat signal. The art director wanted something that was more kind of steam-like, kind of equivalent to when a light bulb breaks and a filament kind of heats up and then smokes when it hits the air. So I did some R&D, that's probably like version 6 up there for that particular render, and then it got applied to the bat signal later on. The middle is that final composite, which kind of muddies and disappears, unfortunately, but everything is all in there. During my career, since around 2008, people who know me know that I like all of these stats and specs and stuff. This is encompassing every single educational video tutorial, class, any training series that I've released since 2008 on the far left. They have increased in time. The far right that you're seeing over here is when I got into Houdini, which was clearly way more interesting to me and involved a lot more information. So the increase in time for teaching and everything got longer. Teaching has been a part of my career, usually as plan B. So I was always putting out educational content whenever I could. If I learned something, I was going to share it back with the community because I was a DIY person. I taught myself how to do visual effects. I learned from the ground up by reverse engineering, by going through as many tutorials as I could, which were very few back in that day. They were just kind of starting out before they got so rampant like they are today. This encompasses roughly about 150 hours of educational content. Of that, 50 hours is at Houdini.school. And these are the 6 classes I currently have up there, all Houdini related, obviously. A lot of my classes are going to be on the core concepts of foundational stuff like attributes and loops, noises that you're seeing down here. Each of these little animated pieces here are just a sliver of what I have in these classes. Anybody who's taken this class or knows me in general knows that I like to pack a lot of stuff and I deep dive when I go onto a topic. So a lot of these classes are probably in the range of 2 to 4 sessions, which is 5 to around 12 hours worth of content to teach you about each of these topics. To kind of go through them, attributes is all of the heart of Houdini, velocity forces to do vector velocities for affecting your simulations, RVD particles, pyro, loops diving into for loops, do while loops, all of that both in VEX and the soft level stuff, as well as Karma is the lock nets. Surface advection is kind of a one-off about advecting orientation vectors that are on the surface of geometry. Liquid SOPs being a liquid simulation without simulation. So it's all SOP-based solutions. So none of that you're seeing right there is simulated. It's all built with SOPs. The noises down here. This is how to take your noises to the next level. You're not using curl noise, correlate, or turbulent noise in its default form. Even using 2 noises, you can turn it into something way more interesting. So I deep dive and take you through a whole top network to use PDG. And what you're seeing scrolling there is an output of 2,000 unique noises that were generated through tops and PDG. And I show you how to build this entire generator, as well as how to just do things as one-offs. And this includes a lot of stuff with like image magic. So it outputs the preview images for you, bakes in the settings, so you can go back to the image that you like, look at the settings, and then be able to replicate what you're trying to build. So teaching is an overarching theme, and that's what FFX Collection is about too, is education. And as part of that, I've been developing this here to kind of push things along education-wise, which is Geometry Explainer. And this is kind of a premiere to kind of announce that I'm going to be releasing this very soon. I'll hop in the Houdini here real quick and just bring that up. It's an object level HDA. It's a very basic, whoops, wrong one. That's going to be next. FFX Geometry Explainer. And what this is basically geared towards educators to have a helpful visual tool to help explain the basics of Houdini with geometry components and attribute classes. These are the most confusing things for a lot of new users. This is also the trickiest thing to kind of really explain. So I like to do a lot of associative stuff. I tend to use Houdini as my PowerPoint, as it were, in my classes. So I build a lot of stuff like this with sliders. We can learn about geometry as in how to unfold and slice the geometry. So if we had UV seams, this would delineate where that actual cut is on the geometry that would allow you to step into UV space, essentially. And we can look at this and see where those cuts are at. There's a little description plus the title of what it is. Flip this over to wireframe real quick here. And we can go through the actual attribute classes. So we can learn about vertex. We can learn about points. We can look at primitives and what they are. And we can look at what detail is. Detail is the actual object itself. Kind of break it down. And we can intermix these so we can look at the associations of how these work together. When you're doing vertex and points, there's also a concept of shared and unshared. So you have visuals that points are shared across with the vertices. And if I shrink these polygons down, we can see that each vertex has its own point when it is unshared. Versus when things are shared, everything is connected. So there's a lot of different concepts that can go over. So these are the attribute classes, the basics right here. And then some extra components here of geometry, which is the edges, and then talking about half edges, which is kind of like this mystery thing for a lot of users, as well as normals. And then just kind of showing how normals usually are going outwards, which is how we want them. If you reverse the winding order of these, the invert and the inward. So there's just different concepts that can be used to kind of help explain these core basics that are vital when you're using Houdini. So this is going to be a tool that I'm going to be releasing fairly soon that will allow you to kind of interact. It's good for students as well, so you can just kind of play around with it and have fun with it. So on to what we're actually here for, which is FFX Collection. I'll play a quick little promo video. So that shows, again, just a sliver of what's in this. There are 50 builds in this, and I say 50 plus because some of these builds actually have more than one in there. There's a couple of variants. This, again, is an object level HDA, and it's very simple kind of user interface here. So there's not much to actually go over in that regard. You basically choose the build you want, you build it, and then you also choose whether or not you want it annotated or unannotated. That meaning there's going to be some sticky notes that are going to basically help you along. There's expressions of HScript that are in this. There's VEX code and a lot of bits and pieces as part of this. I'll open the help docs real quick. So I have a full built out help docs on this to kind of help guide some more information on this. There's a couple of just about me's and whatnot here. There's a section called tips, which talk about some of the top more common expressions that I have used throughout some of these builds. So you're going to see path expressions like this op input path that gets used. There's going to be stuff like op depth that is used and that help you read a lot of textures from the actual test geometry. So there's JPEGs that are named with like Craig, Flippy, and all of that stuff. Using this kind of a setup can allow you to read that actual texture into Karma, which we have Karma builds in a lot of these. Well, VBox, which is a common expression as well, and modular, just kind of talking a little bit more about what that is and how it kind of works. Those are used in various places throughout. This bottom part here, the available scene builds, is probably the most important part. This is where you're going to want to go to basically search for what you're interested in. I've sorted everything by category, and the category I've determined in this case as the primary solution for that particular build. If it was primarily VEX-based, I threw it onto VEX. If it was primarily Flip, it would be on Flip. For the most part, they are all pretty literal. There are a few that do kind of ride the line. I have some Vellum builds that do fall under Vellum and other VEX. But everything is labeled. And there is a list on the side over here of the expressions and VEX functions that may appear throughout that particular build. So if you're trying to look for op input path or say sprint F to understand how it's used in context, this is a quick way to kind of find out which builds you're using. We can use Control F to do a search in here. So if I was to do sprint F, we can see it gets highlighted, and we can just toggle through and see that these builds involve sprint F. To the far right there are some GIFs just showing a visual of it as another reminder as to what you would probably be seeing in that. On 4K, it's kind of a tiny little GIF there, but it's just kind of a quick reference. So I would encourage you to definitely go through the help doc there to kind of get a lay of the land. So like I said, there's a simple just drop down, grab which one you want, choose whether it's annotated or not, and then you build it. And there's also this build all of them down here. If I click this, you're going to get a warning because you're going to have 50 plus builds that are going to get built. Now they are turned off by default for that very reason, because there are a lot of particle sims, pyro sims who don't want those calculating. And like in this case, I'm on frame 30, bad idea. You want to actually be on frame 1, and I do have a warning when you do the individual builds, but it's not going to matter in this case because they are turned off. It'll take a moment to load up all of these, and I will full screen this just so you can see all of the builds that are involved here. And if you want to take a photograph of that too. This is actually associated with this one here, but they're all kind of sorted out. What you're seeing here is VEX, there's VOPs, RBD, Vellum, 4-eaches, flip, stops, and pyro solid. The ones that you're seeing here that are kind of more pink, this may or may not show up on your machine because of the color scheme, the way the stuff kind of carries over. But on my machine, this is basically delineating which ones have Karma renders that use MtlX. So those will have like a full built out render. So the preview stuff you were seeing in the teaser, and any other clips that you see that were rendered online, you have access to that exact shot, the full build, the camera, everything. So I won't be able to like deep dive everything because there is so much. So I'm just kind of cherry pick and go through and show you kind of what's in here overall. So kind of talking, showing up top here. With this, I'm hitting Control B if anybody's curious as to I'm full screening that. So this particular one here is a per prim rotation around edge. This is basically using matrices and just showing how to take each primitive, extrude it along a curve, and be able to control it and get the angles to work all with VEX-based setups like this. And probably what we'll show here real quick before I go any further is just a quick comparison of the annotation. I'm going to say unannotated here and just grab my favorite note. This is going to be the Vellum paper rolling, and you'll see that warning right there. You're on frame 1. The individual builds will actually be turned on when they get created. And it's there. I'll turn that off for a second. Just to kind of show you a side by side real quick. The annotation stuff. So when I mean annotated, I mean that all of these yellow sticky notes that you're seeing across here are basically an explanation of an expression or a quick tip of this is a faster way to do a certain technique. This is explaining beatbox, going through that. They are in network boxes grouping the associated nodes, so that way you know what it's actually talking about and what it's related to. There's going to be stuff where you have solvers and then information that's inside there as well. Just to show you the comparison, that's annotated, and if you did unannotated, if you wanted to just hit the ground running, it's going to be network box for organization. I am nitpicky about organizing my builds in Houdini. Everybody should be doing this, not necessarily this way per se, but they should be organizing in some form. If you plan on going back to your project, this is going to be notes. Your client's going to give you notes. You better know where everything's at and what it's doing. So this is going to be the best way to kind of organize stuff and just understand where things are at so you can dive right back in. So everything is going to be grouped like that. There are going to be, if I go into here, just show this VEX code in here real quick. If you hit Alt-E, you can actually pop that out into its own window. This applies to wrangles as well. And with it being so small, you can hit Control plus or minus to zoom in your text. So all of the VEX code, if there's VEX involved anywhere, it's fully commented. And that will not get removed. Again, going back to organization, that is going to explain what each line of code is doing in here or when it's needed. Now, not all of these builds are going to involve VEX. I know people are kind of anti-VEX in some cases. There are VOP solutions, there are SOP solutions that are mixed throughout. This is just more of a showing a context of how to use all of these various techniques, some of these functions, and so forth. So that's what you can kind of expect in these kind of builds. You'll see the ones in here. You'll see a LOPnet inside. This is the Karma render. So we'll have a full Karma setup here. This is my base kind of go-to. Over there. As far as my de facto Karma setup. Now, Karma obviously is still kind of in beta for XPU. It's in alpha for CPU, but honestly, it's still kind of beta. It's missing a lot of stuff. But this will change probably over time. I'm going to do my best to try to keep pace with that with each of the new releases and update if things break along the line. But this is what you can expect to get from that. Just to show you the annotated version of that. You're going to have the big notes explaining how the render settings are set up, as well as the materials and how each material is kind of set up. This is an example showing how you can procedurally read the COPS texture into Karma versus CPU and XPU. Right now, XPU does not support it. You have to do it from disk from an image, JPEG, PNG. But the actual COPS can be read in through the opdef, or excuse me, op setup in this particular case. That prefix and just pointing to the actual out of COPS. So you can get your texture to come straight in and keep it procedural if you want. So going back to these ones, just kind of give you an overview here of some of what's included here. So a common task is having geometry look at another geometry. And that is just using vex in this case. We try to keep it simple, but it's using the look at function in this case. It's involving a matrix, but this is a very simple setup in this case. So don't be afraid to use vex. If you can type a prompt in the journey, you can type vex code. Yes. Some of the other camera off there. Let's see here. So sliding points along the curve. These are some of the non-rendered ones. So you don't see this promo as often just because there are more techniques. So it's about how to slide geometry along the curve. Repeating ramp values. This was a default thing back in the day. It's since changed to where now values will slant below 0 and above 1. So this is a modulo setup to basically tell you how to get back to this. You can repeat a ramp value across geometry. Ring waves is basically rippling waves in 2D and 3D. Works on flat surface and that with follow-ups. These are less cool looking because they are not rendered. There's geometry ripples. This is one of the few that has multiples in here. So this is all vex-based ripple setups. There's a ripple with noise. This will give some variances in here. So there's that style, and then there's one that's a little more abstract. That's kind of bubbly lava or some kind of random thing that you would want to use. A lot of these are born from conversations over the years of me helping somebody online with a random bit of code or a random technique that they were struggling with. There's an example of sine and cosine here, both normal with noise, ascending and ascending. So doing fall-offs with sine and cosine. Culling back faces. If you're trying to cull geometry based off of your camera perspective. So that camera you're seeing going around, that's this camera. If I look at this from the camera itself, we'll see that the geometry looks normal, but the back side of it is getting culled. Let's see here. Bingway cables is a very heavy one. I'll show the big one here, and violating my rule here. Go back to frame 1 before you start any simulation stuff. This is a Vellum hairs. It's a heavier one here. So it's a punk rock pig, essentially. And this is basically how to use some custom guides using vex. There's like 2 little bits of vex that you have to put in there to just basically assign the actual length and the density of the hair. So you can do your own custom guides on their hair gen. And this is a heavier one, so you can say as quickly. This laptop is not as great. You get the idea here. Another one down here, rotating tiles, is actually pretty good. Using textures, in a image on disk or in Cops if you have something, to basically set the rotation. So this is a grid of cubes that is flat, and it's difficult to see this at the moment. I'll go to a wireframe on the side here once it gets further along in here. Give me a second. Take it to that. So this is basically rotating these cubes in position. And it's driven by the value, the color values of the actual text. So they just kind of rotate in place. So you get some nice undulating patterns. Once you texture this, I think in the preview one I had kind of like a texture, highly reflective and looks really cool once you have all of that in. Guided infection is another fun one. This is where you can set density values to basically constrain your actual infection. I'm gonna go here because I have geometry actually. Remember where I have the output. There it is. So it's an infection solver, but it's constrained. So there's a density value that's basically saying avoid this particular area and go ahead and just crawl within this other area. So there's a couple of VOP setups. There's an orient along a curve. There are native node setups for this, but this is showing you how to do it in VOPs. This is more of an educational setup where you are wanting to deep dive and learn how to gain control of rotations and so forth. So this is a full VOP setup of setting all of your tangents, your bitangents, and normals, and so to get the actual orientation. And what this has is a fall off on this too, so you can twist the geometry one end or wherever you would like based on a actual frame. So this is basically breaking down some of the easier one-off nodes, which some people have to use. There's nothing wrong with that. But deep diving and understanding how to build stuff is very important because when you need to tweak one little thing that the node doesn't have preset for you, you're kind of screwed. You've got to have a base understanding of how some of these techniques work in order to really take it to that next level. Activate pieces is another common task that a lot of people struggle with, especially with glass. Putting that one on. One of the big thing about this is when you pre-fracture glass, those fractures will show up in the render. So like in this case, it's pre-fractured, and then you just activate pieces that then start kind of ticking off over time. And all of these cracks would show up in the render. So there's techniques in there that show how to basically use the connected faces setup to basically remove all of that information. So when you render this, you get a solid piece of glass like you would expect, and only the fractured pieces that are loose are the ones that are showing their actual edges. There's SOP emit every other frame. Emission and SOPs is always a tricky thing for a lot of people. So having one piece of geometry, but changing it over time and emitting into a sim for RDD. So this has an example of that. There's an example, I've had a lot of conversations with beginners and even some intermediates that are unaware of how to apply the proxy sim to their high-res geometry for RDD setups. So this is an example on how to do that. The sim is happening on this low-res geometry, and then that gets applied to this high-res geometry. So not only does that make your sim faster, if you're doing low-res poly setups there, but it allows you to do more pieces because of that. And you can still maintain your high-res geometry after. Paper roofing. This one, because this is kind of my favorite one. This one is set up to be paper that gets blown away in the wind. In this particular setup, it's set up as money, as it were. So it's 100 bills, dollar bills, whatever you want to have in there. That basically just kind of blew away. This is involving a number of different techniques. There's a solver in here that basically activates all of this geometry from top to bottom. So we're looking at a stack of individual geometry here. Each of these geos have like 6 polys, so they're pretty lightweight. And we can see that they just kind of get activated piece by piece, like so. And it works its way down. So this is showing how to animate a activation. And let's turn on this real quick. And so I'm going to show this a little bit. So we can see how these kind of change color over time as they progressively get more and more solid red. That is the trigger that basically says release this piece. And what we're setting is basically an active attribute that is then getting evolved in a solver with some vects. So it's just checking for that attribute, making sure that we're reading that in. And then if it's above a certain threshold, we're going to increment it by adding a value to it. We're going to clamp that just to make sure we stay normalized 0 to 1, which is a common thing. You want to make sure you always do that. And then if that value is above a certain point, or if it's actually 0, we're just going to read in some of the default values just to make sure we don't miss any other pieces inside this particular setup. Now, one thing I do want to show in this is in the solver itself, how it actually gets thrown out. And turn the visualizer off. So a full explanation here because of this setup. It is just a pop, it's a standard stock pop force that is using a little bit of a vex expression. Now, I know I talk about vex a lot. I use vex very commonly. But this is where you're going to get this extra kind of control in this. I'm going to hop up in level here and just pin this so we can see it from this level. And let's see if I can turn on this active. So if I go to the side view by hitting 3, we're not going to see much because it's razor thin. But as these lift up, we're going to see the geometry going up. And as it gets higher, it kind of takes off. So these upper ones are taking off faster versus the lower ones. And basically, that's just broken down into 3 simple steps of taking the active attributes. So we got to know which ones are active first before we do anything. And then getting inside real quick. This active so I can show you. The force on X, Y, and Z, the amplitude, and the swirl size. Those are the only 3 that are getting affected in this entire piece. So we're basically saying if something is active, let's make the amplitude a certain value. So it's just going to be a global value of 5. And if the swirl size down here, I'm basing this off of speed. So this is using currently a length of velocity. For those unfamiliar, the length of a vector is the magnitude is the speed. So for your RBD, for your flip, for your particles, you can get the speed of any of that. And I'm just saying the speed, if it's slow, make it 2.5 for my swirl size. If the speed goes up to 4, make it 0.75. So it weakens as it gets faster. So kind of like in real life, if you have something moving super fast, it doesn't really deviate from its path for the most part. It is following the current, but this is kind of a way to kind of mimic that kind of motion. So the swirl size is super chaotic for stuff that is slower and less chaotic for the stuff that is faster. And then there's just a global force happening for X that is based on the Y value of the geometry. So as the geometry gets higher in its overall height, decided to remove my gene. Probably because there is now an error here. Because I disconnected. Still have an error that's popping up there. I'm not sure exactly what's causing it at the moment, but it's functional, so that's all that matters. So the height of that geometry, basically the higher it goes, the force on the X is going to be greater. The lower it is, the less it's getting forced. And then I basically put another force in there for the height. And basically anything sitting on the ground, I don't want it stuck to the ground and just sitting there. So I want it to kick it up vertically. And that's just going to be based on speed. So if it's really slow, it's going to get kicked up 2 units. And if it's very high, it's going to be less of a force on Y up there. So this is a fun one to play around with up here because this is using actually copy transform. So you can lay out your grid super simple. You just start with a base geo, build out that size. That is your bill, your paper, whatever it may be. We do some copy transform to do the actual tiling of this. And then we copy that again, build it out, and then once more to stack them up vertically. And there's a full explanation of the beatbox setup that's being used in this, and that's just to make sure that these pieces are spaced apart in this particular case. Let's pop one of these other ones. Depending the cloth ripping, this is one that has 3 builds inside of it. And I'll show this one here because this is a little lighter. So this example is basically showing how to art direct ripping. So you can start setting the actual definition of where you want these to be ripped. So if I have a curve here, it's swirling around here, it's just hand-drawn curve. This is going to define where the actual fracturing of that geometry is at. And if through there, we can set an attribute over here to basically release that based on these break types. So the break threshold and the break type. And we can define what part of that fracture actually gets released. So the whole center part of that gets released, but then only these edges right here get released, even though it's fractured all the way across. If the stresses got high enough, then it would actually rip all the way through. So there's examples of that. The other one over here is the face one that you saw at the end of the promo clip where it just kind of bursts open. This is a very heavy one, so I won't cover that one. This one is also a cloth rip showing here. Same thing, just art directing where those holes are going to end up showing up. And if I kind of step through this one, I have to go a little bit up on this because it's heavier. Maybe the post process that's on there. Yeah. So basically, the sides of this get pulled apart, and then once the stresses hit a certain threshold, each of those are going to organically kind of rip apart in one of those holes. But you can predefine where those holes are going to be at. And this particular build also has fraying that happens on the end of the holes that are right there as well. So we're getting like the edge curves of all of those holes. Then we get some template points from those, and then we basically add some fuzz onto those edges. So now we get those little frayed threads that just kind of pop out from the holes as it goes across. How are we doing on time? Still good? Okay. So I'll zigzag through some of these other ones. The pink, yeah, the pink is basically once between karma renders and materials. There is a flip melt. This is also a heavy one here, so let me take down the particle counts. Up. down just a smidge. So what this is basically a flip simulation that uses a map that calls across a noise to basically activate the viscosity in various random parts of it. Now, with this being so low res at the moment, it's not going to do any cooling per se. The higher resolution of particles is going to allow it to interact, so all of the particles will cool out across the floor. Everything, it is a heavier sim to deal with that. And this is actually probably just a smidge too low because it's maintaining the actual height across there. Give that a second to catch up. And basically what that is doing, it's going to melt from the edges here, and it just works its way across to the tail on that. And as it just bends backwards, you'll get different interactions based on resolution. This is the key thing with simulations. Higher resolutions are going to react differently than lower resolutions. And this will take a moment for it to bend over, but we can see the bottom edges are starting to bend down there. And essentially the viscosity goes from really stiff to really liquidy. And then this basically just kind of pulls out across here. This one mesh has an example of getting UVs back onto it. So it's using the actual swab texture reprojected back onto the geometry of it. So you have the liquid kind of pooling out with the texture kind of peeling with it. Give a general idea of how that just kind of starts folding and then pulling down. And the more particles you have in there, like I said, it'll start pulling out. There's an explanation here talking about UV transfer, and this is a FFX setup in this particular regard. There was a number of different ways of doing that. This was kind of the better one that I found that worked as far as dealing with seams and trying to keep the texture kind of seamless for the most part. And you still have a little bit of gaps in there. Filling an object is another common thing that people try to do and have problems struggling with that. So I have a emitter down below inside there. And everything's set to high res. It's basically the resolution you're getting in here is what I've rendered out. So that is like the final resolution. And you can see the fluid kind of going inside here and starting to fill this up. So this is a full example on how to deal with this, and divergence is what's used in this particular case to actually inflate the fluid so it actually fills up our geometry. And let's take that to mesh. We can see that a little clearer like that. Attraction to curve. This is a good one. If you have curves or points that you want RBD or flip, I have two examples. One is with flip, another is with RBD. They are heavy. And I'll just go to where the ceiling is, so we can see the particles, and I will take kind of just a little bit down so we can get to it a little quicker. So essentially, there are some, in this case, predefined curves. One is text, the other is just random curves. It cycles through those. And they are used to basically attract all of the liquid. So if the particles are near a certain point or within a certain distance, they get activated and a force pulls them to it. So you can get this kind of clumping and gathering that happens. And there's a simple trick of just taking the math, which is basically one vector minus another, and inverting those, and then you can have it basically push away. So it's an avoidance versus in the attraction. And I think an example of that is this one here, which was fairly popular. Grid Markets was actually promoting this one for a little while. And I should mention that some of those renders you were seeing too were made on Grid Markets, just because they are heavier renders. And I was also trying to free up my machine so I could get through all 50 plus builds of these in a timely fashion. This is roughly about a little over 3 months worth of work, this entire tool, to put this all together. This is a surface avoidance setup. So the particles are looking for any nearby surface geometry and avoiding that, and to mix it up just so it's not like a simple sphere ring that's around the object. There's noise mixed into that. So as the fluid comes back towards the object, it randomly gets kicked back out into itself. So we start getting these kind of ripples and waves of the fluid. I use Craig a lot across a lot of these. The more interesting test geometry we use. Let's choose that. Show you 8 bits. This again uses Craig. And this is basically reading in the geometry and doing an 8-bit kind of look in 3D. So we get this nice pixelated look with any 3D geometry. And this is set up in a way to where you can pretty much replace the source geometry and be ready to go for the most part with your geometry. The only variance being that this has a Carva render setup and it has obviously Craig's specific texture in it. So there's a setup for that. There is a stone path. This one's super heavy, so I'm not going to go too much into that. That one's basically using volumes to generate procedurally pebbles within a sand texture. And it's based on a curve. So you would have a curved path that you can define so you can make it straight or curl it around something. Echo curve is basically replicating a curve in a way that has follow. So it's just this infinite looping kind of animation. There's just various techniques in there on using noise, replication. These are, by no means, you don't have to use them verbatim. These are a lot of examples of different techniques that are in there that you can cherry pick and plot through builds. Culling random curves. So you can have a curve segment where you pull out segments of the curve but still have it move and act as one unit. So they kind of step through that. This is just kind of like an undulating motion that happens. This one's more interesting in the render form, just because I use the UVs in this. Here I try to load up Karma. Let's give it a shot. And before I do it, yeah, I'm just going to take it down to one sample. This is using, most of these builds are using XPU, just to kind of give you an idea. I hit D to get my options here, just because I like the dark background. Get rid of my grid, get rid of my lights, get rid of the camera. That's one thing with Karma, you get to see everything in your viewport, which is good and bad sometimes. Go over to Karma and cross our fingers. And hopefully, because we're recording, we're doing a lot of stuff. We'll give it a second. Oh, awesome. So I'm using the UVs to basically have an emissive material across there, and that animates. So the UV actually steps across. I'm going to risk it once more too. I'm going to step a frame forward and have it hopefully animate. But essentially, there's some really interesting stuff in there for the material setup on that. So again, all of the annotation notes in there talk about stuff. Everything is MtlX, so there's a lot of custom noises and stuff with MtlX. There are ways on how to generate a random value inside of MtlX. We're kind of used to VOPs and Mantra, where there's a random note. That is not the case at the moment with MtlX, at least that I've found. So I have some custom setups in a few of these where I use class attributes and build out an actual randomizer within the material itself. So there's a lot to kind of peruse through across the board there. This was just a solution a user was asking for about how do I shrink and get rid of my RBD pieces. They wanted to remove them. This is a post solution in SOPs. So you just do your RBD simulation and it just basically erodes and gets rid of the pieces. It's more handy for, say, motion graphics. Pyro. These are some fun ones. And again, very heavy ones. This is how to change color in Pyro and also how to create an actual CD volume. And let's try to find it. Take the resolution of this down a little bit because again, this is super heavy. So this is evolving a volume. Basically using a sign function inside of the color node and generating a color that just oscillates over time. Generating color volumes is always tricky. This is basically a nice clear example of how to do it. And there's also a karma setup on how to actually render volumes in karma. And this is using CPU because XPU doesn't properly view colors at the moment. So you're dealing with VDF and EDF as far as the actual nodes to create your volumes. I'll give you that as a freebie as to how things are connected up. The other one here is volume color emission from a texture. So this is using Flippy. So Flippy's texture essentially is emitting the main colors across here. And this is another heavy one as well. A couple of frames here. We're kind of familiar with Flippy where he's got that dark blue kind of main and then the lighter kind of teal nose on this. Second. This is set up with viscosity as well, so we get a nice smeary, kind of almost like even water kind of feel to it. So we can see how that color is smearing from the teal from his nose versus the blue that's from the rest of his color across there. So that's an example of using color across there. We're basically rasterizing the color to the points themselves. Just put that back up so you can see all of that. Just really quickly, find me. So the QR code up there is my link tree. So there's more links and URLs that are up there. But this is where you can find me online. Any questions on that product or anything else, always feel free to contact me and email me. I am always on all of the forums everywhere. I'm on Reddit, I'm on Slack, I'm on Discord, I'm on every social media. You can't get away from me. Let's put it that way. I'm always looking for ideas and stuff since I'm not in production these years or these days as much. So having conversations with everybody who is in the trenches is always good for me as I get to see what you're struggling with and what I need to build or just getting ideas in general. So you can find me just about everywhere. So if you have a question, interested in learning something, let me know. My main site, FendraFX.com, has way more tutorials on there for After Effects and for Houdini, all 9 yards. And as of this morning, I just launched a tutoring tab on there. I am doing one-on-one sessions that you can now basically just go on Calendly and book me for an hour and we can talk effects or we can talk Houdini in general. It's labeled as VEX, but that's just kind of primary focus in general, but I'm okay talking about Houdini in general if you have questions, or if you're trying to troubleshoot something, or if you're trying to learn something. You can obviously find me over at houdini.school as well. So yeah, with that, thank you.